Few lands carry time as visibly as India. Empires rose, fell, and dissolved into memory. Yet the land remained a living archive of belief, invention, and rebirth. Vedic chants once echoed where digital cities now rise. Conquerors came seeking dominion and left transformed instead. Across its rivers and temples, the search for truth became civilization itself. Woven through Ashoka's mercy, the Gupta's brilliance, and the Mughal dream of unity. To trace India's story is to witness humanity's oldest experiment endure, a civilization that forever reinvents itself without ever forgetting what it is. Long before kingdoms or empires, before the names India or Bharat were spoken, life gathered around the rivers. In the dry valleys that curved through what is now Baluchistan, small bands of herders began to settle. They shaped their homes from mud and straw, built low walls to hold goats against the wind, and learned that the earth could be persuaded to feed them if it was treated with patience. The first seed of civilization sprouted there, at a place modern scholars call Mauryan. What must it have felt like to witness the first harvest, when survival no longer depended on the chase, but on the patience to wait for grain to rise? Have you ever imagined what it was like? As they crushed barley and wheat between stones, storing the meal in baskets lined with clay, men shaped blades from flint and copper, their hands learning precision where once they had relied only on force. Clay figures of mothers, nursing infants appeared beside their hearths, the earliest prayers ever molded by human hands. Across centuries, the rhythm deepened. Mud brick houses clustered close, fields expanded, and the first potter's wheel turned. Kilns glowed red against the twilight, burning the marks of human design into what had once been mere earth. Trade followed, as it always does. Shells from the sea reached this inland plain, and beads from distant valleys found their way into burial jars. The dead lay with ornaments beside them, suggesting that people had begun to imagine life beyond life. The settlements crept eastward, following the rivers that promised more fertile ground. The Indus and its tributaries became arteries of growth, spreading green veins across a landscape that had once been barren. Villages grew into towns. Towns began to mirror one another in plan and structure. Streets ran straight between houses aligned to the sun's course, their drains running beneath brick pavements with a precision that still confounds archaeologists. Somewhere between 2600 and 2500 BC, the civilization that would astonish the modern world emerged. Harappa to the north, Mohenjo-Daro to the south, and dozens of sister cities in between. The cities of the Indus were unlike any others of their time. There were no towering palaces or carved monuments to kings. Authority lived quietly behind the order of walls and streets. Each block followed measured design, each brick baked to the same dimensions, each drainage channel leading into a larger one as though guided by unseen law. In this pattern lay a kind of equality rare in ancient history: urban life without ostentation, progress without tyranny. The river itself was the true monarch. Every year its floods laid down the silt that renewed the fields. Canals drew water toward the outskirts, feeding crops that sustained hundreds of thousands. Farmers and artisans lived side by side, their labor recorded not in royal decrees, but in the clay tokens that mark trade agreements. Small square seals carved with animals, the unicorn, the bull, the elephant, the tiger, served as signatures in a script no one has yet deciphered. Markets filled with the murmur of barter. Copper flowed in from Rajasthan's mines, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, ivory from the forests to the east. Ships ventured from Lothal's dockyards toward the Arabian coast, their cargoes exchanged for Mesopotamian textiles and Sumerian grain. The Indus cities spoke to the wider world through trade, their words carried not by scribes, but by sailors. In the workshops of Mohenjo-Daro, bronze smiths cast tools and ornaments with skill that required both science and artistry. Bead makers drilled holes so fine they could pass a thread through stone. Potters painted geometric patterns onto red clay, their designs echoing across hundreds of miles. A shared aesthetic that bound the civilization together more strongly than any crown. Daily life unfolded with quiet dignity. The people bathed in public pools, whose brick linings still hold water after 4,000 years. Courtyards were swept clean each morning. Wells provided fresh water within nearly every house. The uniformity of these comforts suggests a civic ideal, cleanliness as sacred order, hygiene as moral duty. A people who washed daily in the heat of the plains may well have given the subcontinent its enduring reverence for purification. Their religion remains half hidden, glimpsed through the symbols they left behind. A horned figure, seated cross-legged upon a dais, appears on many seals, surrounded by animals, perhaps an early form of the god later known as Shiva. Other images show women heavy with fertility, their bodies adorned with necklaces and girdles, invoking the power of the earth itself. Bulls, tigers, and elephants recur in scenes of reverence, suggesting a faith woven into the fabric of nature rather than rising above it. No armies guard these cities. No battle scars mark their walls. Power seems to have been measured by cooperation, not conquest. Granaries stored the wealth of harvests for collective use, and civic planning demanded consensus more than command. For nearly 8 centuries, this order held, its harmony preserved by a people whose discipline required neither despot nor deity to enforce it. Yet even the most ordered civilizations depend upon forces they cannot control. Around 1900 BC, the rivers began to shift. The mighty Sarasvati, whose banks had supported many towns, changed its course or dried away entirely. Fields turned to dust, wells yielded less, and the trade routes that connected the cities faltered. One by one, the lights of the Indus went out, not in a single catastrophe, but in a long twilight of drought, migration, and decline. As the great cities emptied, their people drifted eastward toward the Ganges plain. There, the forests waited to be cleared, and the rivers promised renewal. Into this changing world came new wanderers from the northwest, the Indo-Aryans, pastoral tribes whose songs carried the memory of mountains and sky. They spoke of gods, of thunder and dawn, of sacrifice and fire. Their hymns, chanted around ritual flames, would one day form the oldest surviving text of the subcontinent, the Rig Veda. In these verses, the vanished Indus lived on in myth. The poets sang of rivers that nourished life, of cosmic order maintained through sacrifice, of the eternal struggle between chaos and creation. The ritual fires that burned on the plains echoed the hearths of Harappa, and though the language had changed, the reverence for nature remained. Out of the meeting of settled farmers and migrating herders, the foundation of later India began to form, a synthesis of endurance and imagination. By 1500 BC, villages along the Ganges Valley were already blending old and new. The wheel that had turned clay and Harappan workshops now turned beside Aryan hearths. The same fields once tilled by the people of the Indus now yielded to those who sang to Agni and Indra. From this union would emerge the first outlines of Sanskrit, the first hierarchies of caste, and the first visions of cosmic law that would guide India for millennia. The age of cities had ended, but the idea of order endured. Even in ruin, the Indus had left behind something greater than bricks or trade. It had taught a continent how to live together in pattern and rhythm, how to build not merely for survival, but for permanence. Civilization had found its home on the rivers, and its current would carry India forward into the age of kings and faiths that awaited beyond the horizon. By the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ, the plains of the Indus had become a world unto themselves. From Harappa in the north to Mohenjo-Daro in the south, from Dholavira in the salt deserts to Lothal by the sea, cities rose in a pattern so consistent that they seemed drawn from a single mind. The bricks that built them shared exact dimensions. Their streets crossed at right angles. Their drains ran beneath the ground like veins beneath skin. This was not chaos growing into order. It was order made flesh, a civilization designed from the ground up. Life within those walls followed the rhythm of discipline. Mornings began with water drawn from wells that still stand after 4,000 years. Courtyards filled with the sound of clay pots striking against stone basins as families washed before the day's work. Merchants carried baskets of carnelian beads, copper tools, and dyed cloth through markets lined with awnings. In workshops, potters' wheels spun with unbroken hum, while metal workers bent over forges that glowed like miniature suns. Wealth was measured not in conquest, but in craft. There were no thrones to proclaim power, no inscriptions praising kings. Authority was shared, silent and collective. Granaries stood at the heart of each city, their elevated floors designed to keep grain dry through monsoon and drought alike. This abundance made peace possible. When the harvest was secure, so too was the city. Somewhere in that quiet prosperity lay one of history's rarest achievements. Prosperity without tyranny, complexity without cruelty. The people of the Indus looked outward as much as inward. Downriver, their ships sailed toward the Arabian coast. Cargoes of timber, ivory, and lapis lazuli left the docks of Lothal, bound for ports in Mesopotamia, where scribes recorded the arrival of Meluha, the land of distant traders. In return came silver, wool, and ideas, proof that the Indus world was not isolated, but connected to the wider web of human progress. On the tablets of Sumer appear names of merchants who may have spoken the same tongue as those who carved the seals of Harappa. Those seals were the signatures of a people who valued precision. Each bore an animal, a bull with sweeping horns, a tiger mid-stride, an elephant lifting its trunk, and a creature scholars call the unicorn, whose meaning remains hidden. Above these figures ran a script so finely incised that a grain of rice could cover 3 of its symbols. No one today can read what it says, yet even unreadable, it speaks of contracts, of ownership, of belief in the permanence of record. Religion lived in gesture, not doctrine. In small terracotta shrines, figures of women thick with fertility stood beside horned men seated in yogic stillness. The gods of this world were near, embodied in earth, water, and beast. The buffalo that ploughed the field, the bull that guarded the herd, the serpent that watched from irrigation ditches, all shared in the sacred. When later generations sang of Shiva and Shakti, of fire and transformation, they were recalling echoes from these earliest devotions. Even the architecture carried meaning. The great bath of Mohenjo-Daro, lined with baked brick, sealed with bitumen, fed by wells, and drained by precision-built channels, was not simply a pool, but a statement of faith. To bathe was to renew. Cleanliness was not habit, but ritual, the act that bound the individual to the order of the city. Water, always water, drawn, poured, drained, returned. In its motion, the people of the Indus saw reflection of the world's eternal cycle, creation, preservation, and decay. Yet no cycle endures without change. Around 1900 BC, signs of strain appeared. The Sarasvati, lifeline of many towns, began to wither as tectonic shifts altered its course. Fields that had fed thousands turned brittle beneath a harsher sun. Rivers changed their beds, and with them, trade routes. The order that had held for centuries loosened like fabric frayed by unseen hands. The decline came quietly, without invasion or fire. The cities were not destroyed, they were abandoned. Streets once swept daily filled with dust. Kilns cooled. The seals fell silent. Families drifted east toward the Ganges, carrying with them fragments of memory. The art of pottery, the habit of bathing, the instinct for harmony. Civilization did not die. It migrated. Into this emptying landscape came new voices from the northwest. They called themselves Arya, the noble ones, and moved with herds and chariots across the plains. They brought with them songs rather than cities, hymns rather than walls. Around their fires, they composed verses to gods of storm and sky. Indra, the thunderer, Agni, the flame, Varuna, the keeper of cosmic law. These hymns, passed from mouth to mouth, would become the Rig Veda, the oldest scripture still spoken aloud on earth. At first, their world was simple. Tribes ruled by chiefs, wealth counted in cattle. But as they settled among the remnants of the Indus, their songs deepened. The gods of pasture met the spirits of river and field, and belief expanded to match the land itself. The idea of Rita, the cosmic order, began to take shape. The understanding that every action echoed through the universe, and that chaos could only be held back through ritual and right living. Fire stood at the center of it all. Every prayer began and ended with its light. Through it, offerings reached the gods. Through it, man's will met the divine. The Vedic people saw no wall between heaven and earth, only the shimmer of heat rising from the altar. Their priests memorized each syllable, for a single misplaced word could unravel the bond between mortal and immortal. Thus, language became sacred and memory a form of worship. By 1200 BC, the age of wandering had begun to settle. Small tribal domains, or jainas, took root along the Ganges Valley. Wooden forts replaced tented camps. Villages grew around sacrificial grounds where rituals reaffirmed social order. Hierarchies formed, not yet rigid, but recognizable. The warriors, the priests, the herders, the laborers. In this stratification lay the first outline of what later centuries would call Varna, the color of duty, the structure of society. Change gathered like a storm behind the horizon. The forests of the Ganges plain awaited the axe. The Bronze Age gave way to iron. New kingdoms would rise, philosophers would question, empires would unify. But the blueprint of India, the reverence for balance, the union of faith and order, the memory of water and fire had already been drawn. The rivers had birthed it, the hymns had named it, and history was preparing to make it visible. Smoke rose from iron forges where forests once stood. The air along the Ganges grew thick with the sound of hammers striking new purpose from old earth. From this clangor of metal, India's second birth began. Fire had once been sacred. Now it was practical, melting, shaping, hardening the tools that would feed empires still unborn. The Iron Age had arrived, and with it came the transformation of belief into ambition. Across the northern plains, villages thickened into towns, and towns into fortified centers surrounded by farmland and trade. The rivers that had once marked the limits of survival became corridors of expansion. Men cut back the jungle with iron blades, reclaiming the soil inch by inch. Granaries swelled, markets multiplied, and surplus, history's most dangerous invention, produced both wealth and envy. Out of this ferment, the first great realms of the subcontinent emerged. They were called Mahajanapadas, the 16 great nations, some ruled by kings, others by assemblies. They stretched from Gandhara in the northwest to Anga in the east. Each carried its own vision of order: Kosala's stern kingship, Magadha's hunger for control, Kashi's wealth from trade. Between their walls, politics grew sharper than any sword. Alliances were sealed with marriages, treaties, and betrayals. Warfare was not constant, but it was expected, as natural a season as the monsoon. The land had begun to dream of unity, yet unity was still a rumor. Travelers who moved between kingdoms described a patchwork of languages and laws, each proclaiming itself the center of the world. But within that diversity stirred a common restlessness, the sense that beneath the visible world lay another, one governed by truth rather than kings. Philosophy and politics were born together, each testing the other's limits. In the forests where cities had not yet spread, hermits and seekers withdrew from society to ask questions that armies could not answer. What is the self? What is the purpose of birth and death? Can a man, through discipline and knowledge, escape the circle that binds him to pain? These voices, collected into the Upanishads, would shape Indian thought forever. They taught that the soul, the Atman, was not separate from the ultimate reality, Brahman, that within each person lay the same essence that moved the stars. It was revelation by reflection, a revolution achieved in silence. While sages sought meaning, rulers sought permanence. In the kingdom of Kosala, King Prasenajit watched the growth of Magadha with wary eyes. To the south, in Rajagriha, Bimbisara of Magadha was building something new, a realm held not merely by conquest, but by policy. He married strategically, allied shrewdly, and governed with a system that valued administration as much as battle. Under him, Magadha began to turn from one kingdom among many into the seed of empire. But power alone could not contain the spiritual unease of the age. In the shadow of palace walls, a prince of the Shakya clan began to question everything he had inherited. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. Born in luxury, he walked away from it all to seek the cause of human suffering. The story has been told so often that its edges have softened with repetition, yet its truth remains stark. A man turned his back on comfort to understand pain, and in doing so, changed the course of civilization. For years he wandered through forests and plains, studying under masters who taught renunciation and self-denial. When fasting brought only weakness and ritual yielded no peace, he sat beneath a tree by the river Neranjara and resolved not to rise until understanding came. In the stillness of that night, while others slept, enlightenment arrived like dawn, breaking within the mind. He became the Buddha, the awakened one, and his silence became more powerful than any king's command. His teaching spread not by conquest, but by recognition. In the villages of the Ganges plain, farmers and merchants found solace in his words, that suffering came from desire and peace from its release, that compassion outweighed caste, that salvation was not the privilege of priests, but the right of all who sought truth. Monks carried his message from town to town, robes stained with dust, bowls filled with alms, hearts filled with clarity. By the time Bimbisara's son, Ajatashatru, took the throne, the Buddha's path had already begun to reshape the moral geography of India. In the same age, another seeker walked a parallel path. Mahavira of the Jains taught an even sterner doctrine. non-violence so absolute that even an insect's death was a moral wound. His followers renounced property, family, and even clothing, believing that freedom lay in detachment from every possession, every desire, every harm. If the Buddha sought balance, Mahavira demanded purity. Between them, they defined the extremes of India's conscience: moderation and austerity, compassion and abstinence. Two roads leading toward liberation from the same restless world. Meanwhile, in the courts of kings, another kind of inquiry unfolded. The argument between power and philosophy. The rituals of the Vedas still governed the upper classes, their sacrifices sustaining both faith and hierarchy. Priests recited ancient hymns to ensure cosmic order, while monarchs funded these rites to legitimize their own. But outside the fire altars, the new movements of Buddha and Mahavira whispered another possibility: that truth might belong to everyone, not just to the highborn or the learned. The contest was not fought with swords, but with persuasion. Monasteries and markets alike became arenas of debate. Philosophers, ascetics, and householders argued in the open air, their voices rising over the hum of commerce. To the traveler, India must have seemed a nation of thinkers as much as traders, a civilization obsessed not only with how to live, but why. Bimbisara's death, betrayed by his own son Ajatashatru, revealed the instability that lay beneath this brilliance. Power in Magadha passed from father to son through intrigue and blood. Yet even as one generation destroyed another, the machinery of administration continued to grow stronger. Roads connected cities. Spies and messengers kept information flowing. Taxes filled treasuries. War became organized, not chaotic, a tool for statecraft rather than a symptom of it. By the 5th century before Christ, Magadha stood poised above its rivals. Its rulers controlled the lower Ganges plain, its fortresses commanded the trade routes, and its ministers had learned the value of information as much as iron. A new political intelligence had emerged, one that understood that empire begins in the mind long before it takes shape on the map. The age of faith and inquiry was ending. In its wake came an age of calculation. Soon, a new figure would rise from the shadows of these kingdoms, uniting their rival visions under a single crown. His name would mark the beginning of India's first empire, and his reign would prove that philosophy and power, once adversaries, could together forge civilization's most enduring synthesis. The Ganges Valley had become a theater of ambition. By the 5th century before Christ, the 16 great realms jostled like rivals crowded onto too small a stage, their alliances shifting with each generation. Yet the audience, the people, remained largely the same. Farmers who bent to the monsoon, merchants who measured profit by the flood, and soldiers who served whatever banner promised them a meal. Beneath the noise of rivalry, a single current moved unseen, the slow consolidation of power that would carry India from a land of kings to a land of empire. Magadha led the way. Its heart lay between the Ganges and the sun, a region of fertile plains and iron-rich hills. The kingdom's rulers, first Bimbisara and then Ajatashatru, turned those resources into a machine of conquest. Roads bound distant towns to the capital at Rajagriha. Fortresses rose at strategic crossings. The army grew professional, drilled, and supplied. Yet Magadha's genius was not merely in war. It was in the patient art of governance. Tribute replaced plunder. Bureaucracy replaced bloodlust. The result was authority that outlived the men who built it. Ajatashatru, who had murdered his father to seize the throne, ruled with paradoxical clarity. He respected the teachings of the Buddha, even as he fought his neighbors without mercy. His wars against Kosala and Vaishali extended Magadha's reach across the Gangetic plain. When he built the fortress of Pataligrama, later Pataliputra, it was not just another stronghold, but the embryo of an imperial capital. The city's wooden walls would, in time, become the brick and stone of empire. While Magadha tightened its hold, elsewhere the intellectual life of India reached a new brilliance. Across the northwest, teachers of logic and grammar codified the spoken tongue of the Vedas into the structured power of Sanskrit. Panini, a scholar whose name still commands respect after 2.5 millennia, captured the living language in a grammar of near mathematical precision. What others spoke, he measured. What was fluid, he fixed. From his work came not only linguistic order, but a cultural unity that outlasted kingdoms. In Takshashila, the first great university of Asia, students from every realm gathered to study science, medicine, politics, and philosophy. There, among manuscripts and debates, new generations learned the crafts of persuasion and rule. Some would become scholars, others ministers or spies. In those classrooms, theory met pragmatism, the balance of mind and method that would define the Mauryan world to come. The centuries following Ajatashatru's reign saw Magadha expand under rulers whose names have dimmed but whose works endure. Kings pressed westward and southward, binding smaller states by treaty or absorption. The Nanda dynasty, rising in the 4th century BC, inherited both Magadha's wealth and its machinery of control. Their armies, said to number hundreds of thousands, marched behind ranks of elephants whose tread shook the plains. Yet the Nandas inspired fear more than loyalty. Their treasury overflowed, but their rule bred resentment. Even as they commanded the largest force in India, they stood isolated, rich, formidable, and despised. Beyond the Indus, another storm was gathering. In 327 BC, a young conqueror from Macedonia crossed the mountains that had long separated India from the west. Alexander, son of Philip, had already consumed half the known world, and now he sought the edge of it. His phalanxes descended through the Khyber and Swat valleys, encountering resistance fierce enough to remind them that conquest in India would not come cheaply. At the Hydaspes River, King Porus met him with elephants and courage enough to earn even the invaders' respect. The Macedonian victory was real but hollow. His troops, exhausted and homesick, refused to march farther east. Alexander turned back, but the echo of his campaign changed the subcontinent forever. For the first time, India had been drawn into the politics of the Western world. Greek ambassadors, mercenaries, and merchants remained, carrying tales of cities richer than Babylon and armies greater than Persia's. The old frontiers had opened, and through them would pass ideas as influential as armies. Among those who witnessed the turmoil was a man named Chanakya, known later as Kautilya, scholar, strategist, and master of statecraft. He watched as the Nanda kings squandered their strength through vanity and excess. In his writings, he left a doctrine for rulers, the Arthashastra, a text that viewed power not as divine inheritance, but as human calculation. It spoke of espionage, alliances, deceit, taxation, and war, all as instruments to secure stability. A king, he wrote, should be ever active in the management of his state. In that single sentence, he transformed governance into a science. From his frustration with the Nandas and his faith in reason, Kautilya sought a man capable of remaking the world. He found him in a youth named Chandragupta, ambitious, disciplined, and possessed of the rarest gift in turbulent times: patience. Together, they began in exile, gathering support from disaffected generals and provincial governors. When the Macedonian satraps in the northwest faltered after Alexander's retreat, Chandragupta seized the moment. The same roads that had carried foreign armies into India now carried his toward Pataliputra. The conquest was swift and systematic. The Nanda dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own excess, its gold unable to buy loyalty or courage. When the capital fell, the crowd that had once feared the Nandas cheered their end. A new ruler entered the throne room, not as a usurper, but as a restorer. Chandragupta Maurya, young, untested, and relentless, became the first emperor of a united India. His rise marked more than a change of rulers. It was a change of scale. For the first time, the subcontinent was not a mosaic of kingdoms, but a coherent state, governed by reason as much as authority. From Taxila to the Bay of Bengal, the vision of empire had become real. In the silent corridors of Pataliputra's palace, Kautilya's principles were taking form in policy. Spies in every province, accountants in every town, the ruler's will carried along the same rivers that had once nourished the Indus cities. Civilization had come full circle, order restored, ambition disciplined, faith tempered by intellect. The age of wandering sages and rival kings was ending. The age of empire had begun. At dawn, the smoke above Pataliputra glowed like embers scattered across the Ganges. The city had fallen, its gates thrown open, its courtyards littered with banners no longer claimed. From the eastern quarter came the rhythmic tread of an army, marching not to plunder, but to possess. Chandragupta Maurya rode at its head, his armor dusted with ash, his expression unreadable. Behind him walked a man with a scholar's gaze and a hunter's precision. Kautilya, minister, philosopher, and architect of the New World, had kept his promise. The Nandas were gone, and the empire he had designed on parchment was about to take shape in brick and blood. They found silence when entered the palace. Gold vessels lay overturned, silk curtains torn from their rods, the marble floors smeared with the last axe of a dying dynasty. The young conqueror stood before the empty throne and did not sit. He waited for his teacher's nod. Kautilya's approval came not as praise, but as a reminder. A throne, he said, is lighter than air if the king forgets that it rests on the breath of the people. Chandragupta bowed once and took his place upon it. In that moment, India's first empire began. The work of conquest ended. The labor of rule began. Ministers were appointed, provinces mapped, records rewritten. Kautilya oversaw everything with the detached calm of a surgeon. The Arthashastra he had written was no treatise for posterity. It was a manual of control, as practical as a blacksmith's hammer. Spies disguised as monks drifted through temples to measure loyalty. Inspectors weighed grain in distant markets. Governors submitted scrolls listing every coin minted and every soldier fed. For the first time in centuries, the land obeyed a single command, carried down river and road to the farthest village. The machinery of empire grew with astonishing speed. Pataliputra became the hub of a vast network, its avenues radiating outward like spokes on a wheel, its palace offices humming with scribes who turned governance into ritual. From dawn until dusk, messengers rode out bearing sealed copper plates engraved with the lion of Magadha. At every frontier post, watchmen stood beneath that emblem, understanding that its meaning was not glory, but order. Kautilya's genius lay in transforming human weakness into political strength. He divided authority so that ambition consumed itself before it could threaten the throne. Each minister watched another. Each informer was shadowed by two more. Yet the system did not stifle. It functioned. The army was paid on time, the treasury overflowed, and the granaries never emptied. The empire's stability was not born of faith, but of efficiency, and that discipline became its own kind of devotion. To outsiders, it seemed miraculous that such unity had arisen from chaos. To Kautilya, it was simple arithmetic. Prosperity required peace. Peace required strength, and strength required information. His ruler learned well. Chandragupta lived more as servant of the state than its master. He rose before sunrise, heard petitions at first light, trained with the guards before breakfast, then presided over councils until the stars returned. No decision escaped his eye. No province operated without his sanction. The king, Kautilya wrote, is not a man. He is the realm itself. Beyond the palace, the empire widened. To the northwest, where Greek satraps still ruled remnants of Alexander's conquest, Mauryan banners advanced along the Indus. Those cities, garrisoned by mercenaries tired of exile, fell one by one. When Seleucus Nicator marched east to reclaim them, Chandragupta met him with elephants instead of phalanxes. Their armies camped within sight of one another, the Ganges wind carrying the mingled smell of sweat, oil, and anticipation. Yet battle never came. Seleucus, recognizing the strength he faced, offered peace. In return for distant provinces, he received friendship, and his daughter's hand in marriage to the Indian emperor. From that treaty flowed trade, learning, and an understanding between two worlds that had once stared at each other across the Hindu Kush in suspicion. By the end of Chandragupta's second decade of rule, the empire stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the Bay of Bengal, and from the Himalayas to the southern plateau. Provincial capitals, Taxila, Ujjain, Tosali, Suvarnagiri, governed territories larger than entire kingdoms of earlier ages. Along the royal highways, trees were planted for shade, wells dug at regular intervals, and rest houses built for merchants and pilgrims. The empire breathed through these arteries, each road a sign of unity stronger than any fortress. Pataliputra itself became a living map of that unity. Greek envoys described a city longer than Athens, girded by a wooden wall pierced with 64 gates and protected by a moat that shimmered like steel beneath the sun. Inside, the capital divided itself by trade and craft. The district of goldsmiths, the quarter of potters, the markets of ivory and silk. The royal granaries towered above it all, reminders that power came not from temples or thrones, but from the full stomachs of the people. The court combined austerity with ceremony. Chandragupta sat on a low seat carved from sandalwood, his robe plain, his presence immense. Ambassadors from distant lands found him courteous but unreadable, a man who weighed silence as others weighed gold. Around him gathered philosophers and mathematicians, physicians and astronomers, all protected by a ruler who valued knowledge as defense. Learning had become policy. The people felt the change. Farmers who once paid tribute to a dozen petty lords now answered to one tax collector. Banditry declined, roads cleared, markets grew. For the first time, a merchant could travel from the Indus to the sea without bribing or bleeding. Even the riverboats that ferried goods down the Ganges flew the lion seal, a promise of protection that bound the empire's subjects by trust rather than fear. But peace brings its own temptations. As prosperity deepened, whispers reached the court of arrogance among governors, of corruption hidden beneath the smooth order of bureaucracy. Kautilya, now old and wary, reminded his pupil that empires rot from within long before they break from without. Chandragupta listened, but something in him had begun to turn inward. Years of command had worn away the certainty of youth. The violence that had built the state lingered in his mind like smoke that would not clear. It was during a pilgrimage to the Jain communities of the Deccan that the emperor's restlessness became renunciation. The monks who met him spoke of non-possession and the freedom that followed detachment. At first he listened out of courtesy, then out of hunger. When his son Bindusara took the throne, Chandragupta left the capital and journeyed south to the hill of Shravanabelagola. There he laid aside crown, food, and speech. The ruler who had commanded millions spent his final days in silence, fasting until his breath ceased at sunrise. In Pataliputra, the empire he founded continued without pause. Tax ledgers were still balanced, soldiers still drilled, governors still sent their reports on time. The machinery ran as if its creator were only absent, not gone. That was his true legacy, a system that no longer required its maker. From the dust of Magadha, Chandragupta had raised a unity the world had not seen since the pharaohs. He had turned Kautilya's logic into a living nation, and from that discipline, India learned the language of rule. Yet his final act, the rejection of all he had built, foreshadowed the greater transformation that would follow. In the palace he had once ruled, a child grew to manhood, restless and brilliant, heir to both empire and conscience. His name was Ashoka, and in him the fire that had forged the Mauryas would burn once more, this time to illuminate, not to conquer. The empire Chandragupta had built endured beyond his lifetime. Steady under the rule of his son, Bindusara, the new emperor expanded what he inherited, pushing Mauryan influence deep into the Deccan and across the central plains. But the true test of the dynasty, the moment that would transform its destiny, belonged not to him, but to the grandson who would inherit his throne. Ashoka's rise was not foretold in prophecy. It was carved in the hard choices of politics and blood. When Bindusara died around 273 BC, his sons turned on one another like wolves over the same carcass of power. The empire that seemed so stable trembled beneath their rivalry. In the palace corridors of Pataliputra, whispers spread of a prince who ruled the western provinces with efficiency bordering on ruthlessness. He was not the eldest, nor the court's favorite. He was, however, the only one both feared and respected. When the dust of succession settled, it was Ashoka who stood, amid the silence, his brothers gone, his authority absolute. The young ruler inherited a machine of government more complex than any before it. Governors, ministers, spies, and generals awaited direction. The empire's arteries pulsed, but needed new command. Ashoka gave it. Like his grandfather, he rose before dawn, held council at sunrise, and judged disputes himself. His first years were marked by the same vigor that had made the Mauryas dominant. Taxation standardized, frontier defenses strengthened, trade routes expanded. Under his watch, the empire reached farther south and west than even Kautilya had envisioned. But empire, once in motion, demands more than administration. It hungers for conquest. In his 8th year of rule, Ashoka turned that hunger toward the only major kingdom that still defied Mauryan control, Kalinga, on the eastern coast. The campaign began with confidence. Armies marched along the coastal road, elephants thundered through the forests, and rivers ran red in their wake. Kalinga resisted fiercely. Its people fought not for tribute, but for their homeland. When the fighting ended, the land lay broken. 100,000 were said to have died, many times more taken captive. On the field of his greatest victory, Ashoka walked among the bodies of the fallen. The smell of blood hung over the plain, mingling with the salt wind from the sea. Chroniclers would later say that he saw a single mother searching for her son and turned away in silence. Whether true or not, the transformation that followed was undeniable. The conqueror who had brought peace through force began to see his triumph as a crime. In that reckoning was born Dhamma, a word older than faith, broader than creed. It was not a religion, but a code, compassion for all life, restraint in victory, tolerance among beliefs. Ashoka made it his state's foundation. The emperor who had once wielded the sword now took up the chisel. Across the empire, from the Himalayas to the southern hills, workers carved his edicts into stone pillars. Written in Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic, they spoke to everyone in their own tongue. Honor parents, respect teachers, care for animals, seek truth, harm none. The walls that had once proclaimed orders of conquest now carried words of conscience. Governance changed accordingly. Prisons were reformed, justice tempered with mercy. Hospitals for people and animals rose along the royal roads. Ashoka sent inspectors to ensure the welfare of villages, not the collection of taxes. Even war elephants were treated under edicts forbidding unnecessary slaughter. The empire's armies remained, but their victories were no longer measured in blood. They stood as guardians of peace. Beyond his borders, the emperor reached outward, not with armies, but with emissaries. Envoys carried messages of friendship to the Seleucid, the Egyptian Ptolemy, and the Macedonian Antigonus. To the south, missionaries sailed across the Indian Ocean to Lanka and Suvarnabhumi. To the northwest, others traveled through Afghanistan into Central Asia. The Buddha's teaching, once confined to the Ganges plain, now crossed mountains and seas. Stone pillars in far-off lands still bear witness to his will. Pataliputra, at its zenith, glowed like the center of the known world. Greek visitors compared its palaces to those of Persia, its gardens to the hanging gardens of Babylon. The wooden halls rose on stone foundations, each beam carved with lotus and lion motifs. The emperor lived simply within their grandeur, eating only fruits and vegetables, sleeping on a low bed, and receiving petitions surrounded not by dancers, but by monks. His court had become less a palace than a monastery of power. Ashoka's Dharma officers traveled ceaselessly through the provinces, delivering messages of kindness and moderation. They mediated disputes, reported famine, distributed charity. For the first time, moral instruction was a branch of government, yet not all approved. Brahmin priests accused him of diminishing traditional sacrifices. Generals whispered that peace had made the army soft. Even among his ministers, there were those who longed for the clarity of conquest. The empire, vast and complex, could no longer be held by the will of one man alone. In his later years, Ashoka withdrew from daily administration, devoting himself increasingly to meditation and the patronage of Buddhist councils. He gathered monks from across the realm to define the faith's teachings and prevent its division. At Pataliputra, the third Buddhist council convened under his protection, sending forth missionaries to every corner of the known world. His reign had begun in war and ended in persuasion. When he died, around 232 BC, there was no public mourning decreed, no monumental tomb erected. His ashes were divided into relics and enshrined across the empire in stupas that gleamed like drops of frozen dawn. The man who had turned empire into conscience left behind no inheritance of gold, only pillars of stone and the memory of a ruler who had made morality a matter of policy. But the empire he humanized began to fade with his passing. Successors lacked his vision. Provinces asserted independence. Governors remembered their own ambitions. The machinery still turned, but without the heart that had animated it. by 180 BC, the Mauryan line ended under the last ruler, Brihadratha, slain by his own general. The empire that had united half the world's population dissolved into fragments, and yet its idea endured. Roads still followed the routes Chandragupta had carved. Villages still governed themselves under the order he and Kautilya had devised. The stone pillars of Ashoka still rose above fields where kingdoms came and went. Long after his banners vanished, the words he carved remained legible, that power finds its purpose not in conquest, but in compassion. In the dust of those inscriptions, India's conscience found its voice. The Mauryas had fallen, but the notion of a just ruler, of empire guided by moral law rather than fear, would echo through every dynasty that followed. What began with Chandragupta's sword ended with Ashoka's silence. A journey from dominion to understanding, from the will to rule to the will to do good. Civilization had completed its first great circle. The fall of the Mauryas left India without its anchor. What Chandragupta had forged and Ashoka had moralized began to fragment into a dozen ambitions. In Pataliputra, the last Mauryan lay dead, and beyond its walls, new banners rose, Shungas in the north, Satavahanas in the Deccan, Indo-Greeks pressing from the passes of the northwest. Yet this disunity did not bring darkness. Freed from the weight of empire, the subcontinent breathed again, and its regions began to sing in their own voices. Pushyamitra Shunga seized the empty throne around 185 BC, a general turned ruler who restored the old fire rituals that Ashoka's piety had subdued. His soldiers guarded the heartland of Magadha, while the frontiers stirred with foreign tides. To the west, men of Greek speech and Macedonian blood rode across the Hindu Kush. They were the heirs of Alexander's forgotten satrapies, and they brought with them not conquest alone, but curiosity. Coins struck with their names bore both Greek legends and Brahmi letters. Zeus on one side, Shiva, or the elephant on the other. These newcomers founded realms of paradox, foreign in origin, Indian in spirit. In the valleys of Gandhara and Bactria, art transformed. Sculptors trained in the Hellenic craft of muscle and drapery turned their chisels to the image of the Buddha. For the first time, the enlightened one gained a human face, calm eyes, flowing robe, a faint smile caught between worlds. The stone of these hybrid statues carried two civilizations meeting in the same gesture of serenity. Trade followed the chisel. Caravans wound from the Indus through passes to Samarkand and beyond, their goods glittering beneath the same stars that guided Roman merchants on the Mediterranean. Ivory from the Ganges, pepper from the south, fine muslin from Bengal, all travelled west, while glassware, wine, and silver coins came east. Along those routes, ideas travelled faster than merchants. Astronomy from Babylon, motifs from Greece, and stories that would one day return as legend. Far to the south, the Deccan thrived under the Satavahanas, successors of the Mauryan governors who had declared independence when Pataliputra's power waned. Their capital at Pratisthana stood astride trade lines that linked the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. Kings like Gautamiputra Satakani extended control over the Western Ghats, issuing coins that blended local dialects with Sanskrit verses. They built stupas at Amaravati and carved caves into cliffs where merchants financed monasteries as acts of both faith and advertisement. In those rock-cut shrines, frescoes bloomed, lines of donors, processions of elephants, scenes from the Buddha's previous lives. The artists painted not saints aloof from the world, but human beings caught in the play of compassion and desire. Monks read scripture by lamplight, while sailors below waited for the monsoon's turn. Religion had become a patron of art, and art in return carried belief farther than sermon or sword. Across the Tamil lands, 3 crowns, Chola, Chera, and Pandya, shared the stage of the Sangam age. Their poets sang of love, war, and honor in verses as clear as rain. Kings rewarded bards with gold and land. Queens and courtesans appeared in equal measure in the poem's praise. Ports like Kavaripattinam and Muziris welcomed ships from Arabia and Rome, their warehouses heavy with pepper and pearls. The Roman geographer who wrote of India's riches spoke of a people who have more gold in their markets than we in our temples. While the south grew rich by sea, the north ripened in thought. The early centuries before Christ saw new schools of logic and medicine, Nyaya and Ayurveda, take coherent form. Physicians catalogued herbs. Philosophers debated the nature of perception. Grammarians refined Sanskrit until it could express anything the mind conceived. Out of such discipline came beauty, drama, lyric, epic. Somewhere in these centuries, poets wove the stories of Rama and Krishna into great tapestries of language, their characters embodying virtues that would outlive every dynasty. Yet the pattern of fragmentation persisted. After the Satavahanas came the Western Kshatrapas. After them, the Kushans, a people of Central Asian origin who swept down from the Indus Valley in the 1st century AD. Their greatest ruler, Kanishka, inherited both ambition and curiosity. He convened a vast Buddhist council at Kashmir, patronized Greek and Indian artists alike, and sent monks north toward China along the Silk Road. Under his rule, Gandhara art reached perfection, its marble calm spreading eastward until the Buddha's face was known from Taxila to Nanjing. Kanishka's empire stretched from Kabul to the Ganges, an arc of cultures that coexisted rather than collided. His coins carried the faces of many gods, Mithra, Shiva, Buddha, even the Greek Helios, proclaiming in metal what his reign embodied in spirit, multiplicity without disorder. When he died, his kingdom fractured, but the world he connected did not fall apart. The Silk Road endured, carrying India's goods and faiths across continents. In the 2nd century, merchants sailing from Egyptian ports followed the monsoon across the Indian Ocean, guided by Greek navigators who had learned to read the winds. They reached the harbours of Bharuch and Muziris, where Roman gold poured into Indian treasuries in exchange for spices and silk. Amphorae stamped with Latin names still lie buried beneath those coasts. Rome's luxury was India's livelihood, and though emperors might lament the drain of coin, their wives continued to wear Indian pearls. Through centuries of shifting dynasties, a subtler power took root: language and faith. Sanskrit, once confined to ritual, became the tongue of learning and diplomacy. Buddhism and Jainism thrived beside the older Vedic worship, and temples began to replace wooden shrines with stone sanctuaries that defied time. In the caves of Ajanta and Ellora, artisans carved entire cosmologies into living rock, deities frozen mid-gesture, dancers caught in eternal motion, lions guarding the gateways of silence. By the 3rd century AD, the political map again waited for a unifier. The Deccan kingdoms weakened, the western Kshatrapas faltered, and the memory of Magadha's ancient greatness stirred. In the city of Pataliputra, now quieter but not forgotten, a minor chief named Chandragupta of the Gupta line began gathering allies. He was neither conqueror nor philosopher yet, but his marriage to a Lichavi princess bound the power of the Ganges plain to his rising fortune. North India, weary of invasion and division, leaned toward stability as plants turned toward light. Trade had enriched it, learning had refined it, art had sanctified it. What remained was cohesion. Out of that desire, the Guptas would rise, bringing with them an age that later generations would call golden, not for its wealth alone, but for the radiance of its mind. When Chandragupta the first rose from a minor ruler to the sovereign of Magadha, it seemed less the birth of a new dynasty than the return of an old memory. The rivers that had once mirrored Mauryan banners now reflected Gupta ones, simpler in emblem but radiant in promise. Through alliances rather than slaughter, through calculation more than conquest, he reforged the unity that centuries of division had undone. The marriage to a Lichavi princess gave him legitimacy among the Ganges elites. The stability that followed gave India back its center. His son Samudragupta transformed that foundation into dominion. He was poet and warrior in equal measure, a ruler who inscribed his victories in verse upon the stone of Allahabad. The inscription still speaks across the ages, of 30 kingdoms subdued, of tribute from the Himalayas to the southern seas, of compassion to those who submitted and annihilation for those who did not. His campaigns carved the map anew, but his genius lay in what came after, the decision not to govern every conquered land directly. Vassal kings were restored to their thrones, bound by oath and admiration. It was empire as orchestra, every realm playing its part in harmony with the center. Trade revived along the routes that Ashoka's roads had once traced. Iron and textiles from the Ganges, spices from the south, gold from the mines of Karnataka, all flowed into markets that hummed with the sound of calculation. Foreign coins arrived from the Roman world, their emperors' faces soon replaced by the graceful profiles of the Guptas. Each coin was art in miniature. The king standing with bow or lute, the goddess Lakshmi seated upon the reverse, wealth and devotion minted together. But the real splendor of Gupta rule lay not in its wars or wealth, but in its mind. The court of Pataliputra and Ujjain became sanctuaries of learning. Scholars gathered to measure the heavens and define the logic of earth. In the observatories of Kusumapura, Aryabhata watched the stars and dared to suggest that the earth itself might move, that night and day were born not of the sun's wandering, but of the planet's rotation. He measured eclipses, mapped constellations, and gave numbers a new language. The concept of zero, the silence that allowed mathematics to speak infinitely. Elsewhere, Kalidasa turned the Sanskrit tongue into music. His plays, Shakuntala, Vikramorvashya, Malavika, and Agnimitra, flowed through courts and villages alike. They spoke of love, duty, and the beauty of the natural world, with a grace that made poetry a mirror for philosophy. In The Cloud Messenger, an exiled lover sends his words northward on the drifting monsoon, and even today the verses seem carried by the same wind. Kalidasa's language became the measure of elegance itself, his imagination the landscape through which later generations would walk to find themselves. Religion, too, entered its own flowering. Hinduism, long a weave of rituals and hymns, gathered coherence under the Guptas. Temples of stone replaced the temporary fire altars of earlier ages. Images of Vishnu, Shiva, and Devi emerged in sculpted form, serene, symmetrical, perfectly balanced between power and compassion. The human body became the geometry of divinity. In caves and shrines, artisans learned to translate theology into curve and line. Their mastery turned faith into architecture. Buddhism endured beside it, serene but quieter. The monasteries of Nalanda and Vikramashila grew into universities, drawing students from Tibet, China, and far-off Korea. Their libraries held thousands of manuscripts. Their courtyards rang with the debates of monks who spoke not only of nirvana, but of grammar, medicine, and metaphysics. Jain scholars, too, found patrons in Gupta courts. The empire did not insist on a single truth. It allowed them all to coexist, like colours in a mural whose harmony depended on difference. Across the empire, stone and bronze replaced perishable wood. At Sanchi and Deogar, temples rose on square plans aligned to the compass, each element an embodiment of cosmic order. Frescoes at Ajanta glowed with pigments ground from lapis and ochre, depicting kings, merchants, and saints in motion so fluid it seemed to breathe. The artists signed nothing, yet their anonymity became part of the devotion, the creator dissolving into creation. The Guptas also codified the law that underpinned society. Smritis and Dharmashastras gathered centuries of practice into formal rule: duties of kings, rights of subjects, conduct between castes, inheritance, marriage, crime. Justice became predictable, if not always merciful. Yet the same era produced a gentleness in literature that balanced its strictness in code. The Panchatantra taught wisdom through fables. The Kama Sutra explored desire not as sin, but as one more expression of balance. Knowledge, in every form, was the empire's faith. Under Chandragupta II, Vikramaditya, by title and legend, the realm reached its apogee. His court at Ujjain gathered the famed 9 jewels, poets and scientists whose names became synonyms for excellence. Trade with the West continued, but now ambassadors came from abroad seeking learning rather than gold. The Chinese pilgrim Faxian walked the Gupta roads in safety, recording lands of prosperity where the law was mild and prisons few. His chronicles described an India confident in its order, content in its peace, a civilization that no longer measured itself by conquest but by cultivation. Yet perfection carries its own fragility. Wealth bred complacency. Provinces learned self-reliance. The frontiers, long quiet, began to stir. From the steppes of Central Asia, Huna horsemen rode south, testing the edges of imperial defense. Their raids scarred the northwestern plains, and though Gupta generals repelled them for a time, the cost was heavy. By the mid-5th century, the empire that had ruled from sea to sea was already thinning at its borders. Still, decline did not erase achievement. Even as power fragmented, the ideals the Guptas had refined persisted. Their art set the canon for sculpture. Their language became the standard of literature. Their tolerance the model for later kings. The Golden Age was not a moment of wealth alone. It was the crystallization of identity. India, long divided by river and mountain, had discovered the unity of spirit that would outlast every empire to come. When the last Gupta kings faded into the dusk of history, they left no monuments of ruin, only the radiance of their example. Their cities might crumble, their gold might tarnish, but the thought they nurtured, mathematical, poetic, spiritual, remained incorruptible. In the silence after their passing, the subcontinent did not mourn, it remembered. For from their harmony of reason and beauty would emerge the resilience that carried India through the centuries ahead. The torch had passed from power to culture, from the sword to the mind, from empire to civilization itself. When the light of the Guptas faded, India did not fall into ruin, it scattered into brilliance. The great unity that had once stretched from sea to sea dissolved into smaller realms, each carrying a shard of the vanished Golden Age. Northern plains, southern coasts, and the Deccan Plateau turned into theatres of ambition, their kings ruling less by empire than by personality. Yet amid this division, something subtle and enduring took root: devotion. The age that followed was less about conquests than about faith and art, less about boundaries than about belonging. In the north, Magadha's throne lay empty. From its fragments rose new powers, the Maukharis in Kanauj, the Vardhanas in Thanazar, and a score of others whose names linger only in inscriptions. The first among them to command all the Ganges plain was Harsha, son of a dynasty too modest for its own legend. His rise in the early 7th century was swift, his governance gentler than most conquerors could afford. When he entered Kanauj and made it his capital, the city bloomed again, the Ganges glittering with the reflection of palaces, monks debating in its courtyards, merchants arriving from the far west with silk and wine. Harsha ruled through persuasion more than fear. His armies were vast, but his rule rested on intellect. He wrote plays in Sanskrit, corresponded with the Chinese emperor, and treated scholars as equals rather than ornaments. When the pilgrim Xuanzang reached his court, he found a monarch of austere habits who bathed at dawn, ate once a day, and held great assemblies where Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu teachers argued their truths before the throne. Harsha listened to all, converted to none, and protected every creed alike. For 40 years, he held together the north without tyranny. And when he died childless around 647 AD, the balance he had preserved unraveled almost immediately. After him, Kanauj became the prize that every ambitious ruler sought. The centuries that followed, the era chroniclers called the tripartite struggle, pitched 3 kingdoms against one another: the Pratiharas of the west, the Palace of Bengal, and the Rashtrakutas from the Deccan. The plains turned into a chessboard of sieges and alliances. Victories counted not in permanence, but in prestige. Yet this rivalry, fierce as it was, kept the subcontinent alive with energy. Each kingdom, while contesting for Kanauj, poured wealth into temples, universities, and trade. Competition, not collapse, defined the age. In Bengal, under Dharmapala and Devapala, the Pala kings became patrons of Buddhist learning. They rebuilt Nalanda University into a city of knowledge. 8 compounds, 10,000 students, the air thick with the scent of ink and lamp oil. From its libraries, ideas travelled eastward with the monks who carried them. Logic to Tibet, sculpture to Burma, and the Pali scriptures that would form the backbone of Southeast Asian Buddhism. Bengal's brick stupas glowed like embers along the rivers, silent markers of an intellect that refused to fade. To the west, the Pratiharas ruled from Rajasthan, heirs to the martial traditions of the Rajputs. Their forts crowned desert hills, their walls thick as cliffs. Kings like Mihira Bhoja defended the northwestern passes against Arab incursions and preserved India's independence in an age when Islam had already reached the Indus. In their courts, poets revived Sanskrit verse with pride equal to any Gupta laureate. Every victory was celebrated not merely with tribute, but with composition. Between them lay the Deccan, where the Rashtrakutas turned the plateau into an empire of stone. From their capital at Manyaketa, they commanded routes from Gujarat to the Coromandel coast, controlling both commerce and culture. Their legacy survives not in the ruins of fortresses, but in the perfection of a single monument, the Kailasanatha temple at Ellora, carved downward from a single hill of rock. It was not built but released, as if the mountain had been persuaded to yield the abode of Shiva from its own heart. Its colonnades, elephants, and sculpted deities formed a hymn in stone, a declaration that devotion could equal any empire. While kings fought and artists carved, religion itself was transforming. In the villages and towns, the people turned from ritual to emotion, from priestly recitation to personal faith. The Bhakti movement began to stir. softly at first, through poets who sang in the languages of the fields, rather than the Sanskrit of scholars. Their verses praised Vishnu or Shiva as friend, father, beloved. They spoke not to priests, but to hearts, carrying sanctity beyond temple walls. It was the beginning of a revolution in spirit, one that would outlast every dynasty that fostered it. In the far south, the Tamil world continued its golden rhythm. The Pallavas of Kanchipuram, heirs to the ancient Dravidian polities, built cities of stone that seemed half sculpture, half scripture. The shore temples of Mahabalipuram rose like prayer frozen in wave and wind, their granite towers facing east toward the sea. Beneath their spires, artisans traced myth into reality. Krishna lifting the mountain, Durga slaying the buffalo demon, gods and mortals intertwined in the eternal dance. The Pallava kings, while often at war with their neighbors, filled their reigns with the serenity of art. Trade bound the southern coasts to distant worlds. Ships from Arabia and China anchored at ports where Tamil merchants dealt in pepper, pearls, and sandalwood. Roman coins still surfaced in marketplaces centuries after Rome itself had fallen. The Bay of Bengal, once a barrier, had become a highway of culture, carrying language, faith, and architecture to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Temples in Cambodia and Java bore the imprint of Indian hands, their spires reaching toward a sky that mirrored the subcontinent's own. The Deccan, too, pulsed with diversity. The Chalukyas of Badami built shrines that blended northern and southern styles, curving shikaras meeting pillared halls, stone cut so fine it seemed woven. Jain monks walked beside Shaiva priests, their rival philosophies finding expression in the same artistry. In the basalt hills of Aihole and Patadakal, inscriptions describe not conquest but creation, each temple an offering of gratitude for a victory, a marriage, or simply a season's peace. Through these centuries, India's unity was not political but cultural. Sanskrit remained the bridge between kingdoms. Trade routes kept rivers of wealth and communication flowing. Pilgrims journeyed from Kanchipuram to Bodh Gaya, from Ujjain to Rameswaram, tracing a map defined by sanctity rather than sovereignty. Every region had its gods, its dialects, its kings, but all shared the conviction that the divine was not a distant ruler, but a presence woven into daily life. By the close of the 9th century, the rhythm of devotion had replaced the drumbeat of empire. Across the plains and plateaus, bells rang from temple towers at dawn, echoing over fields that had once seen armies. The age of unity had become an age of faith, the sword yielding to the chisel, the palace to the shrine. India had entered a new equilibrium, fragmented in rule, yet whole in spirit. The centuries ahead would test that equilibrium. Pilgrims and poets would give way to raiders and reformers. The currents of the world beyond the mountains would soon reach these shores again. But before the storms returned, the subcontinent stood at peace with itself, a mosaic of kingdoms joined not by borders, but by belief. By the dawn of the 10th century, the pulse of power had shifted south. While the north drifted between fleeting dynasties, the Deccan and Tamil lands entered their own renaissance, an age when temples became cities, and kings measured their glory not only in conquest, but in the architecture of faith. The Cholas, the most formidable of these southern dynasties, turned devotion into dominion. Their ships ruled the sea, their inscriptions mapped half the known world, and their legacy would endure longer than their banners. The story began with Vijayalaya, a minor chieftain who seized the town of Thanjavur around 850 AD. His descendants transformed that foothold into an empire. Under Rajaraja the Great, the Cholas reached the height of their strength. commanding lands from the Godavari to Ceylon. He was not a mere conqueror, but a builder. In the heart of his capital rose the Brihadiswara temple, its tower a pyramid of stone that climbed toward the sky in perfect proportion. At its summit, a single granite dome weighing 80 tons rested with impossible grace. The temple was more than a monument. It was a declaration that faith and engineering could be indistinguishable. Pilgrims who entered its courtyards saw the empire's soul written in stone. Walls flamed with carved processions of gods, dancers, elephants, and kings. Beneath their feet, inscriptions, recorded donations of land and gold, taxes levied not for war, but for worship. Every merchant guild and artisan family contributed to its creation, turning religion into civic enterprise. Even centuries later, the shadow of its tower falls on the city as if to remind the living that eternity can be measured in human precision. Rajaraja's navy made the Cholas a maritime superpower. His fleets sailed from the ports of Nagapattinam and Kaveripattinam, following monsoon winds that had once carried foreign traders to Indian shores. Now they carried Indian soldiers, priests, and merchants outward, to the Maldives, to Sri Lanka, and across the Bay of Bengal to the kingdoms of Sumatra and Java. These were not colonies in the modern sense, but cultural outposts, spreading Tamil architecture, sculpture, and script across Southeast Asia. In the inscriptions of Angkor and Srivijaya, Indian gods spoke in local tongues. The Chola state itself was an intricate organism. Beneath its imperial grandeur pulsed a bureaucracy, both complex and flexible. Villages governed themselves through assemblies called sabas and ur, composed of elders chosen by lot rather than birth. These councils managed irrigation, taxation, and education, leaving the king to command the larger machinery of war and diplomacy. It was governance by participation, centuries ahead of its time, a democracy of duty sustained by belief in order. After Rajaraja came his son, Rajendra, a ruler whose ambition turned even the oceans into highways. He marched north to the Ganges, bringing back its sacred water in golden vessels to sanctify a new capital, Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Its temple, a rival to his father's masterpiece, reflected the same monumental vision, massive, serene, invincible. From there, he launched naval campaigns that struck as far as the Malay Peninsula, defeating the Srivijaya Confederation and establishing Chola influence over the entire Eastern Sea. His empire was the last in Indian history to project power so far beyond its shores. Trade followed where war receded. Pepper, sandalwood, and jewels left India's ports for China and Arabia. Silk, gold, and porcelain returned. The Indian Ocean, once the route of foreign merchants, now carried Indian fleets. Inscriptions from the 10th and 11th centuries record Tamil merchant guilds, Ayyavale, Manigramam, Nanadesi, establishing warehouses and temples in foreign lands. Their wealth flowed home to endow monasteries, libraries, and feeding houses. Commerce itself became a form of devotion. Religion, too, continued to evolve. The Bhakti movement that had begun in the fields now reached the courts. Poets like Apar, Sundara, and Manikavachakar composed hymns in Tamil that merged mysticism with emotion. Their songs, the Tevaram, echoed through temple halls at dawn, turning music into prayer. In the Vaishnava tradition, the 12 Ulvas saints sang of Vishnu's love in verses of longing and surrender. Through their poetry, divinity became intimate, accessible to every soul. The language of the people had become the language of the gods. The Pallavas faded into memory. The Pandyas re-emerged at Madurai, their courts glittering with scholars and artisans. The temple there, dedicated to Meenakshi, grew into a city of towers, its gates painted with the hues of sunrise. Bronze casting reached perfection under the Cholas and Pandyas alike. The sculptors of the Chola foundries created icons of Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, balanced upon a ring of fire. In that single image, movement and stillness became one, destruction and creation inseparable. The world has rarely seen art so alive. The Deccan, meanwhile, passed from one hand to another. The later Chalukyas ruled from Kalyani, their inscriptions invoking both Shiva and Vishnu with equal reverence. The Western Kalyani, Chalukyas, and their rivals, the Hoysalas of Dwarasamudra, competed not only in war but in architecture. The Hoysalaswara temple at Halebidu remains a poem in stone, walls covered in spirals of narrative, dancers frozen mid-turn, celestial armies sculpted in relief so fine that shadow itself seems carved. The devotion of these kings was measured not by creed but by craftsmanship. North India, during these centuries, remained fractured but vibrant. The Gurjara Pratiharas faded, giving rise to smaller Rajput clans who fortified their pride within sandstone citadels. They built temples that mirrored their own spirit, upright, ornate, defiant. In the desert at Ossian and the hills of Khajuraho, their sanctuaries rose with towers that climbed like flames, each sculpture a fusion of divinity and desire. The sensual carvings of Khajuraho were not indulgence but philosophy, the belief that all life, sacred and sensual alike, flows from the same divine source. Beyond the mountains, new forces gathered. Arab merchants had long since settled along the Malabar coast, building mosques beside temples and marrying into local families. Islam entered India not through conquest but through commerce, its first call to prayer mingling with the bell of the shrine. Yet the tides of empire were turning again. From the passes of the northwest came Turkic horsemen, whose arrival would reshape the subcontinent's destiny. Their approach was still a rumor in these centuries, a whisper carried by traders returning from Afghanistan. But the kingdoms of India, rich, proud, and divided, stood on the brink of a new encounter. For now, the land flourished. Fields yielded abundance, artisans adorned every shrine, and poets turned divine truth into melody. Across 1,000 temples, lamps were lit at dusk, their flames reflected in the eyes of worshippers who saw the eternal in the ordinary. The age of devotion had reached its height, a civilization anchored in faith, propelled by art and connected to the world by wind and wave. Soon those winds would carry a different sound, the clash of iron against stone, the meeting of two civilizations that would remake both. But before that reckoning, India stood complete within itself, luminous with confidence. The temples of the Cholas, the hymns of the saints, the ships that crossed the sea, all spoke of a people who had learned to express divinity in every form of creation. The next age would bring conquest and synthesis, loss and renewal. Yet even then, the world that had flowered here, the harmony of thought, craft, and worship, would remain the root from which new faiths would grow. The temples would stand, the poetry would endure, and the sea would continue to whisper the same refrain along the coast of Thanjavur. That devotion, once awakened, never truly sleeps. It began not with an invasion, but with a vacancy. In the last years of the 12th century, the northern plains of India had no single guardian. The Rajput clans, brave but divided, fought each other as fiercely as any foreigner. Into this vacuum rode armies hardened by the deserts of Central Asia, horsemen whose speed was their armor, whose discipline was their faith. At first they came as mercenaries serving distant masters, then as conquerors serving none. What followed would remake the subcontinent's destiny and its soul. Muhammad of Ghor was the first to break the frontier. His soldiers swept through the passes of the Hindu Kush, their banners bearing verses from the Quran and the dust of Khorasan's plains. At Tarain in 1192 AD, his general Qutb al-Din Aibak faced the Rajput king Prithviraj Chauhan beneath a sky thick with arrows. The battle was long remembered not for its scale, but for its symbolism. The age of mounted archers had met the age of armored valor, and the sword of the desert proved swifter than the pride of the plains. When the smoke cleared, the path to Delhi lay open. Muhammad returned west soon after, leaving his newly conquered territories in the hands of his slave general, Qutb al-Din. The word slave meant little of servitude and much of trust. Men bought as soldiers, trained in loyalty, freed by merit. In 1206 AD, when his master was assassinated in distant Ghazni, Aibak declared independence. From commander he became sultan, from servant a sovereign. Thus began the Delhi Sultanate, the first Muslim kingdom rooted not in transience but in Indian soil. Delhi, ancient yet restless, became his capital. There he began to build, not merely fortresses, but permanence. From the ruins of Hindu and Jain temples rose the Quwwatul Islam, the might of Islam, its arches carved from older stone, yet unified by new design. Beside it, the Qutub Minar climbed toward the sky, a tower of red sandstone inscribed with Arabic calligraphy. It was both monument and minaret, a symbol of victory and a call to prayer echoing over a city learning a new rhythm. The Mamluk, or slave, dynasty that Aibak founded carried the paradox of its origin: authority born from discipline, not inheritance. His successor, Iltutmish, was the true architect of the Sultanate's survival. Where Aibak had conquered, Iltutmish organized. He minted coins in the name of the caliph in Baghdad, earning legitimacy even as he ruled independently. His empire extended from Bengal to Sindh, stitched together by lines of cavalry patrols and relay posts. Beneath his seal, Delhi grew from camp to capital, its streets filled with Persian scribes, Turkish guards, Indian artisans, and Afghan merchants. When he died, the nobles debated succession, but his daughter Razia refused to be forgotten. She mounted the throne in 1236 AD, a woman in a court of men, riding to battle veiled only by her armor. Chroniclers could not decide whether to admire or condemn her. She ruled briefly, wisely, and fell to intrigue, but her name endured, the first and last woman to rule the Sultanate in her own right, a reminder that courage recognizes no gender when history demands it. The following decades saw turbulence as dynasties rose and fell. The Khaljis seized power in 1290, led by Jalaluddin and later his nephew Alauddin, a ruler as brilliant as he was merciless. The Mongols, who had burned half of Asia, reached India's borders again and again, but Alauddin met them with walls and strategy instead of panic. Delhi's defenses held, its armies reformed into a professional force. The Sultan regulated markets, fixed prices, and punished corruption with severity that bordered on obsession. Under his rule, the granaries overflowed, trade flourished, and spies reported even the whispers of governors. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. To his people, a necessary one. Southward, his ambitions were limitless. Generals marched beyond the Vindhyas, conquering the Deccan's rich kingdoms of Warangal and Madurai. The plunder returned to Delhi in caravans of gold, horses, and jewels. Wealth so vast that poets wrote of the city glowing at night like a second sky. But conquest, for all its glory, left exhaustion in its wake. After Alauddin's death, intrigue consumed his court, and the line of Khaljis ended as violently as it began. The Tughlaqs followed, led first by Ghiyasuddin and then by his son, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a man of genius ruined by his own imagination. He dreamed of an empire governed by reason, new taxes to fill the treasury, a second capital at Dawlatabad to balance the north and south, copper coins to replace silver. Each idea was ahead of its time. Each collapsed under the weight of its idealism. Farmers rebelled, merchants hoarded, soldiers deserted. When famine struck, the Sultan found himself ruling over silence. Chroniclers later called him mad, but perhaps he was only too modern for his century. His cousin, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, inherited what was left and turned reformer instead of dreamer. He built canals and hospitals, repaired monuments, and softened the harshness of law. Scholars and architects found patronage again, and Delhi regained a measure of grace. Yet even in peace, cracks deepened. Provinces grew independent. Bengal, Malwa, and Gujarat drifted away. By the close of the 14th century, the Sultanate's hold had weakened, its grandeur still visible, but its foundation hollow. Still, the age had not been one of conquest alone. In the meeting of Islam and India, something new had taken shape. Persian poets wrote of the Ganges as though it were the Tigris. Indian artisans carved lotus and arabesque side by side. Mosques borrowed the geometry of temples, and Sufi mystics spoke of the divine with the tenderness of the Bhakti poets. From Ajmer to Delhi, from Bengal to Gujarat, shrines arose where people of every creed gathered to seek solace in the same songs. Faith, once the language of division, had become the language of longing. The Sultanate's legacy was as architectural as it was cultural. Arches replaced lintels, domes replaced spires, and calligraphy became ornament. Delhi's skyline changed. The Qutub still towered above it, joined now by mosques and palaces, whose courtyards caught the evening light. In these new spaces, stone told the story of synthesis, imported vision shaped by local hands. What began as conquest had become collaboration, conscious or not. But history rarely allows stillness for long. To the north, across the Oxus, the shadow of a new storm gathered. Timur, the conqueror of Samarkand, had begun to look eastward. His armies, forged in the steppes, carried with them the fury of the Mongols reborn. The city that had withstood invasion for nearly 2 centuries would soon face the reckoning that no wall could stop. For now, Delhi still stood, the heart of a realm that had learned to survive not through unity, but through adaptation. The Sultanate had brought new faith, new art, new laws. It had also inherited India's gift for transformation. The next century would test how deeply that gift ran, when fire would again descend upon the plains, and from its ashes at our rise another empire altogether. By the end of the 14th century, Delhi no longer ruled. It endured. The empire that had once stretched from the Khyber to Bengal had shrunk into anxious provinces, each governed by men who spoke of loyalty while sharpening ambition. The Tughlaqs, weary heirs of a restless lineage, clung to power through inertia. Firoz Shah's gentle reforms had softened the Sultanate's edges, but they had also dulled its will. When his successors quarreled, the throne changed hands as often as the seasons. Governors grew bold, soldiers unpaid, peasants taxed to the bone. The empire was a body still standing after the soul had gone. Beyond the northern frontier, the steppe winds carried rumors of a new terror. Timur of Samarkand, descendant of Genghis in spirit, if not in blood, was already master of Persia and Central Asia. His empire moved where he willed, swift as dust storms, ruthless as drought. In 1398 AD, he crossed the Indus with the precision of a surgeon and the appetite of a flame. The border towns surrendered without contest. The plains offered no resistance worth the name. Delhi, leaderless and hollow, waited like a city that had forgotten how to pray. The armies met at the banks of the Yamuna. The Sultan, Mahmud Tughlaq, fielded war elephants in their iron armor, towers of muscle and thunder that had terrified invaders for centuries. Timur's archers met them with fire. Naphtha-soaked arrows turned the beasts against their masters. The ranks collapsed before the battle had truly begun. Delhi's gates opened soon after, not in defiance, but in despair. What followed was less a conquest than a cataclysm. For days the city burned, its mosques and temples indistinguishable in ruin, its streets filled with the echo of screams. Chroniclers wrote that corpses lay piled so high the sun could not see the earth. When Timur finally withdrew, leaving behind only ashes and terror, he took no throne, only loot, slaves, and the satisfaction of having undone a civilization. His army marched back through the Punjab, leaving silence in its wake. Delhi, emptied of half its people, stood as a monument to impermanence. The once golden capital of the East had become a graveyard of empires. Yet even ruin in India carries renewal in its shadow. From the chaos of Timur's invasion rose new centers of power, smaller, defiant, and deeply Indian. The Sayyid dynasty, claiming descent from the Prophet, rebuilt a semblance of government in Delhi around 1414 AD. Their rule was modest, their ambitions realistic. They governed by negotiation, not force, aware that every province beyond sight of the capital was already sovereign in spirit. To the west, Gujarat and Malwa grew wealthy on trade. To the east, Bengal flourished as an independent sultanate. In the Deccan, the Bahmani kings held their own courts of Persian luxury and Indian sensibility. The Bahmani realm, stretching from the Godavari to the Krishna, became a crucible of cultural fusion. Persian administrators served alongside Kannada generals. Urdu began to take shape as a language of the barracks and the bazaar, a blend of Turkic, Arabic, and local dialects. Its poetry, rhythmic and direct, carried the voice of soldiers and merchants alike. The Deccan mosques bore domes that echoed Samarkand yet were carved by hands that had built Hindu shrines. India was learning, once again, to turn invasion into invention. In the north, the Sayyids yielded to the Lodis, an Afghan clan whose vigor restored momentary stability. Bahlul Lodi reunited parts of the Punjab and Doab, balancing tribal pride with bureaucratic discipline. His son, Sikandar, expanded the realm and made Delhi breathe again, commissioning gardens, schools, and mosques where weeds had grown. Under his reign, the capital regained its hum of commerce, though the shadow of past devastation lingered in the corners of every marketplace. But the Lodis, like every dynasty before them, could not escape the rhythm of fragmentation. Court factions festered, governors nursed grudges, ambition outgrew allegiance. In the west, the Rajput confederacies rose again, proud as ever, carving independence from neglect. In the east, Bengal remained apart, its rivers carrying more trade than loyalty. The Afghan aristocracy that filled the Lodi court distrusted the Persian scribes who managed its administration. Beneath the outward calm, Delhi's foundation was once again cracking. The Sultanate that had once feared the Mongols from beyond the mountains now faced their heirs from within. Far to the northwest, a new power was forming. a dynasty descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, tempered by Persian culture and Central Asian discipline. Its young leader, Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, ruled the small kingdom of Fergana and dreamed larger than his inheritance. Driven from Samarkand, he turned his gaze eastward, toward the rich but divided plains of Hindustan. His letters speak of longing, not merely for conquest, but for restoration, the sense that he would claim a land that had once belonged to his blood. In 1526 AD, Babur crossed the Khyber with a force scarcely 20,000 strong. Infantry, artillery, and the strange thunder of cannons new to the Indian battlefield. At Panipat, he met the army of Ibrahim Lodi, larger by far, but weighed down by its own disunity. The morning fog hid the maneuver that decided the battle. Babur's field fortifications and gunpowder fire shattered the Afghan advance before it reached striking distance. When the smoke cleared, Delhi lay open once more, not to looters or zealots, but to a man who came to rule. The age of the sultans had ended in the thunder of a new weapon and the arrival of a new idea. The Delhi Sultanate had lasted 3 centuries, longer than most empires survive, but its legacy outlived its rule. It brought to India the arch and the dome, the Persian chronicle, and the Arabic script, the discipline of cavalry, and the melody of the Sufi qawwali. It gave birth to languages that still carry its cadence, and to architecture that still shades its cities. It fractured the land, yet widened its imagination, making room for plurality even in conquest. As Babur entered Delhi, its ruins still bore the scars of Timur's fire, but the people lit lamps again, as they always had. The city had fallen and risen too many times to fear another master. On those same foundations, a new empire would rise, one that would blend Mongol endurance with Indian abundance, sword with art, conquest with vision. The story of India was preparing to turn another page, written now in Persian ink and Mughal gold. Mist still clung to the fields of Panipat when the first cannon roared. The ground trembled beneath a noise India had never heard, a sound not of thunder, but of revolution. Ibrahim Lodi's war elephants, armored in steel and fear, turned upon their own ranks as Babur's guns spoke the new language of power. By sunset, the age of cavalry was over, and the dust of the plain had swallowed a dynasty. Babur, Prince of Fergana, exile of Samarkand, grandson of Timur and heir of Genghis Khan, stood at the edge of his improbable destiny. On that cold April evening in 1526 AD, the Mughal Empire began not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Babur entered Delhi as a foreigner who wished to belong. His memoir, the Baburnama, tells not of conquest, but of wonder, the scent of mango groves, the press of monsoon air, the chaos of markets and faiths. The land is rich, he wrote, but the men have no order. He meant no insult, he meant potential. He set about imposing rhythm where there had been only noise. His soldiers, veterans of Central Asia, built canals, repaired roads, and re-established the mint. Artisans displaced by war found new patronage, scholars new protection. Gardens rose along the Yamuna in geometric balance, divided by water channels that mirrored the paradise of Persian poets. To Babur, harmony was victory, beauty, governance. He ruled barely 4 years before illness took him, but in that brief time he planted the seed of a new ideal, an empire defined not by blood or faith, but by administration, artistry, and endurance. When he died in 1530 AD, they buried him facing Kabul, in the land of his youth, but his dream remained rooted in India. The crown passed to Humayun, his son, a man of gentler spirit but unsteady hand. He inherited a fragile throne and too many enemies. The Afghan warlord Sher Shah Suri rose against him, a soldier of peasant birth who believed order could be built from precision. Humayun fled across the desert, the dust of Sind clinging to his robes as exile replaced royalty. But Sher Shah proved the worth of the empire he stole. His 5 years of rule reshaped India's arteries. The Grand Trunk Road, running from Bengal to the Khyber, linked towns with milestones and rest houses. Uniform coinage stabilized trade. Taxation became a science rather than extortion. His empire ended with his death, but his model endured. Even his rival's son would one day rule by his methods. When fortune turned, Humayun returned with Persian aid, reclaiming Delhi in 1555 AD. The city greeted him without celebration. Within months, he slipped on the marble steps of his library, struck his head, and died with a book in his hands. The empire seemed cursed to flicker out before it could shine. But history, as always in India, was already preparing its resurrection. The boy who inherited the throne was 13 years old, Akbar, son of Humayun, grandson of Babur. Around him, courtiers schemed, and kingdoms tested the empire's weakness. His regent, Bairam Khan, fought with the ferocity of desperation, defeating the Afghan forces at a second battle of Panipat. When Akbar came of age, he dismissed his guardian with honor, unwilling to rule from another man's shadow. At 16, he was master of a realm that existed only on parchment. By 40, he would command a subcontinent. Akbar's genius was not sudden. It unfolded like strategy itself. He conquered with patience, absorbing territories one by one, not raising them but integrating them. Gujarat's harbors brought him the sea. Bengal's deltas fed his granaries. Kashmir's valleys became his gardens. He surrounded himself with men of skill rather than lineage. Rajputs, Persians, Afghans, Hindus, and Turks. Each found a place in his system of mansabdars, officers ranked by merit, paid in land and honor. From this hierarchy rose a bureaucracy capable of governing more people than any empire before it. He understood that unity required more than conquest. In the 3rd decade of his reign, he moved his capital to a new city, built from red sandstone on the plains near Agra. He called it Fatehpur Sikri, the city of victory, but it was also a city of ideas. Its courtyards opened like thoughts. Its corridors balanced symmetry with surprise. Persian arches met Indian columns. Domes rested upon Kshatris, and every facade reflected both Central Asia and Hindustan. At its heart stood the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, where Akbar would sit upon a circular platform supported by a single pillar, carved with the symbols of every creed. Bridges radiated from the center to the surrounding galleries, a physical map of his empire and his philosophy, all faiths meeting at the sovereign's reason. Religion, the great divide of history, became his instrument of reconciliation. Akbar listened to the mullah and the pandit, to the Jain monk and the Jesuit priest. He invited them to debate in the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship, where he sat silent amid their arguments, absorbing more than he spoke. Out of their noise, he distilled his own creed, the Din-i-Ilahi, the religion of God. It had no scripture, no rituals, no priesthood. It preached reason, compassion, and loyalty. Critics mocked it as vanity. Admirers saw it as revelation. But even those who rejected his creed could not ignore his tolerance. Under his reign, Hindu temples reopened, Jesuit churches rose, and the empire's coins bore no sectarian symbols, only the light of his name. His tolerance was practical as well as philosophical. The Rajputs, India's proudest warriors, had fought the Mughals for generations. Akbar turned them into allies. He married their princesses, shared their feasts, and entrusted them with command. The fortress of Amber sent generals instead of rebels. The proud house of Marwar gave him loyal kin. Only Mewar held out, led by Rana Pratap, who chose exile over submission. Their battles became legend, valor meeting valor, pride refusing compromise. When Pratap died in the forests, Akbar is said to have wept, calling him a king without a crown, but with honor unmatched. While the armies marched, the empire flourished in peace. The revenue minister, Toda Mal, introduced reforms that measured land and harvest with mathematical precision. Taxes were fixed by productivity, collected in grain or coin, and reinvested in irrigation and infrastructure. Merchants traveled the roads safely. Artisans thrived under royal workshops. From Kabul to Bengal, markets glittered with textiles, spices, gems, and the hum of a stable economy. Akbar's empire was not an occupation. It was an organism. Art and scholarship followed prosperity. The historian Abul Fazl recorded the age in his monumental Akbarnama, blending fact and myth into a living chronicle. The court artist Basawan painted his subjects with shading unknown to Indian art before him, creating portraits that seemed to breathe. Music, too, found its golden age. The singer Tan Sen transformed ragas into prayer, his voice said to calm storms and ignite lamps. In Akbar's court, beauty became a duty. But for all his power, Akbar ruled by restraint. His palace was grand, but never gaudy. He rode with soldiers, ate sparingly, and kept his ears open to petitioners. Each Friday, he weighed himself against gold, donating the equivalent to charity, not out of superstition, but out of example. A ruler, he once said, must be like the rain that falls on all alike. His justice, firm yet human, made him beloved across faiths. Hindu villagers called him Jalaluddin Akbar Badshah, Muslims Akbar the Great. To his people, he was not foreign, but familiar, a ruler who had found the pulse of India and matched his heart to it. As his power grew, so did the contradictions within it. The empire's wealth depended on harmony. Its harmony depended on him alone. The vast administration he had built demanded constant oversight. The noble families he elevated sought ever greater reward. Toward the end of his reign, factions emerged around his sons, each claiming to inherit not just his throne, but his vision. When Prince Salim rebelled in 1600 AD, Akbar's patience faltered for the first time, yet he forgave him, as fathers do, and restored him to favor before his death. In the autumn of 1605 AD, the emperor who had united more than 50 million souls lay dying in his fortress at Agra. The courtiers recited prayers in Persian and Sanskrit alike, unsure which language heaven preferred. Outside, the Yamuna flowed past the gardens he had planted, silent witness to his legacy. When the last breath left him, India paused. The empire he had built was not merely a kingdom of walls and coins. It was a civilization of coexistence. Akbar had found what neither conquerors nor saints before him had achieved, a way for the many to live as one without ceasing to be many. In his wake came his son, Jahangir, whose reign would celebrate beauty but struggle with indulgence, whose love for art and for one woman would define an age. The Mughal world was at its zenith, radiant and whole. Yet beneath that radiance, time was already stirring the first hints of decay. For no empire, however enlightened, can outlive the perfection of its own balance. When Akbar died, the empire mourned like a man who has lost his reason. For half a century, he had been both ruler and conscience. Now, the machine he built would have to move without its mind. Into that silence stepped his son, Prince Salim crowned Jahangir, conqueror of the world. The name sounded like ambition, but the man behind it longed more for beauty than dominion. Where his father had sought order, Jahangir sought perfection. Where Akbar had preached harmony, Jahangir practiced indulgence. The empire entered its age of refinement, when power became an art, and art became a way of ruling. He took the throne in Agra beneath the stars of 1605 AD, surrounded by courtiers who bowed as much to his inheritance as to his person. Yet Jahangir was no weak shadow of his father. His justice, if occasionally whimsical, was famed for its immediacy. He hung a golden chain from the walls of his palace, attached to a bell that any subject might ring to seek redress. Behind that gesture lay genuine curiosity about the world. His memoir, the Tuzuk-i Jahangiri, reads like a naturalist's journal. He describes the flight of birds, the color of gems, the taste of strange wines, the habits of men. The court that gathered around him gleamed like a mirror, reflecting two civilizations. Persian miniature painters refined their craft under his gaze, perfecting the subtle realism that would define Mughal art. Abul Hassan, Mansur, and Bichita captured emperors, saints, and animals with equal reverence. To Jahangir, the artist's brush was a means of worship. To his empire, it became a record of abundance. But behind the soft air of his reign moved a sharper mind, Nur Jahan, his 20th and most formidable wife. She entered his life as a widow of noble Persian birth and transformed it entirely. Intelligent, ambitious, and possessed of a poise that bent courtiers without raising her voice, she became the empire's co-ruler in all but name. Edicts bore her seal, coins carried her title. She designed gardens, sponsored trade, and mediated politics with elegance sharper than any sword. Under her guidance, the Mughal court achieved its peak of grace, blending power and poetry into the same gesture. Yet the ease of Delhi hid unrest at its edges. The Deccan simmered with rebellion. Afghan warlords tested the empire's borders, and the Portuguese held the western seas with arrogance. Jahangir relied increasingly on his generals and his heir, Prince Khurram, later known as Shah Jahan. But the transition from father to son was never smooth in the house of Timur. When Jahangir died in 1627 AD, the succession again ran with blood. Khurram emerged victorious, sealing both the throne and his legend. Under Shah Jahan, the Mughal Empire reached the summit of its aesthetic and political power. If Akbar was the architect of unity and Jahangir the patron of art, Shah Jahan was their culmination, the ruler who turned empire into perfection. From his capital at Agra, he commanded lands that stretched from Kandahar to the Godavari, from Kabul to Bengal. The revenue of his dominion surpassed the treasuries of Europe combined. But his true monument was not measured in gold or land. When his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died giving birth to their 14th child, grief became his master. For 2 years, he withdrew from the court, wrapped in white mourning. Then he began to build a tomb, worthy of both his sorrow and his empire. On the banks of the Yamuna rose the Taj Mahal, a miracle of marble and proportion. 20,000 artisans worked under his supervision. Architects from Persia, Turkey, and India combined their genius into a single design. The dome floated like a moon upon earth, its reflection shimmering in the long pool before it. In that perfect symmetry, the empire immortalized its own illusion, beauty that believes it can defy time. While his builders carved eternity from stone, his administrators carved order from chaos. The empire's provinces, subas, were governed with precision. Their taxes filled treasuries. Their roads connected seas to mountains. Caravans carried silks, indigo, and spices through deserts guarded by Mughal forts. In Surat and Hooghly, European traders established settlements under imperial license: Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French, all competing for a share of India's wealth. The world was beginning to shift from empire to trade, but the Mughals did not yet sense the tide. The emperor's domestic peace, however, was not his family's. Among his sons, Dara Shikoh, Shuja, Murad, and Aurangzeb, the rivalry that had haunted every Mughal generation grew malignant. When Shah Jahan fell ill in 1657 AD, the empire trembled again under the weight of succession. Dara, the eldest, was scholar and mystic, fascinated by the Upanishads and the Sufi path. He dreamed of blending Islam and Hinduism into a single philosophy of divine unity. His brother Aurangzeb saw heresy in such dreams and strength in orthodoxy. Their struggle split the empire's soul. When Aurangzeb triumphed, Dara was executed, and Shah Jahan, once builder of the world's greatest tomb, was confined within the Red Fort of Agra. From his prison, he could see the Taj Mahal across the river, glowing under the same moonlight that had inspired it. He died there in 1666 AD. The marble of his grief turned into his shroud. Aurangzeb's reign would be the longest and most complex in Mughal history, half ascetic, half imperial. He rose each day before dawn for prayer, copied the Quran by hand, and lived with the austerity of a monk. Yet he ruled an empire so vast that its administration alone would have humbled lesser men. At its height, his dominion encompassed nearly the entire subcontinent, save for the far south. His armies marched relentlessly. Bijapur fell, Golconda surrendered, and the Deccan lay under his banners. For a time, it seemed the Mughals had achieved the impossible: total control. But control is not peace. The emperor's piety hardened into policy. The music that had filled his forefathers' courts was silenced. Artists sought patrons elsewhere. Temples destroyed in war were not rebuilt. Non-Muslim nobles lost favor. Though he reinstated taxes on Hindus that Akbar had abolished, his intent was administrative, not vindictive. But perception breeds resentment faster than decree. The Rajputs of Marwar rebelled. In the Deccan, the Marathas rose under a warrior named Shivaji, whose courage and cunning turned mountain passes into fortresses. Against him, Mughal discipline found its match in local genius. For years the struggle raged, siege after siege, treaty after betrayal. Aurangzeb's armies captured Shivaji's son, burned villages, built new forts, but victory brought no rest. The empire expanded, yet its treasury drained. Its soldiers aged in endless campaigns. The emperor, now an old man surrounded by maps and letters, began to understand what he had gained and what he had lost. "I have conquered the world," he wrote in his final years, "but not myself." The empire that had once celebrated synthesis was now exhausted by singularity. Trade routes shifted toward the coasts, where Europeans grew bolder behind their fort walls. Persian and Afghan nobles quarreled at court. Governors kept more revenue than they remitted. In Bengal, local rulers acted like kings. In the Deccan, Mughal generals ruled as satraps. The vast edifice still stood, but its columns were hollowing from within. Aurangzeb's last campaigns were waged not for expansion, but to prevent collapse. When he marched south to the Carnatic at the age of 70, he commanded an army larger than any fielded by Rome, but his enemies multiplied faster than his victories. He lived in tents for years, writing letters of loneliness and fatigue. "I came alone into this world," he confessed, "and I go as a stranger, full of errors." In 1707 AD, after nearly 50 years on the throne, he died near Ahmadnagar, wrapped in a plain white cloth of his own weaving. He ordered his burial to be simple, his grave unmarked by marble or dome. The empire he left behind was vast, magnificent, and trembling. The Mughal ideal, the union of faith and reason, of beauty and power, had reached its furthest edge and begun to fracture under its own weight. Yet the legacy endured. The architecture of their reign, forts, palaces, mosques, still glowed beneath the Indian sun. Their administration, art, and language still defined the land. Persian mingled with Sanskrit to form Urdu, the poetry of hearts and soldiers alike. The music suppressed under Aurangzeb would reawaken in villages. The literature born in Akbar's court would outlive the courts themselves. By the time the emperor's body was laid to rest, the empire's future had already changed hands invisibly. In the coastal factories of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, foreign traders had begun to count India's riches in ledgers rather than chronicles. The British, who came as merchants, watched as the empire they would one day inherit began to crack. But in 1707 AD, none could yet imagine it. For now, the Mughal world still glittered, its domes untouched, its prestige unbroken, its shadow vast enough to stretch across the next century. The Mughals had ruled India for nearly 200 years. They had brought blood and brilliance, tolerance and tyranny, ruin and renewal. Their story was not the rise and fall of a dynasty, but the long arc of a civilization learning its own balance. In Akbar's reason, Jahangir's art, Shah Jahan's sorrow, and Aurangzeb's faith lay the four faces of India's soul, each true, each incomplete. Together, they formed the mirror in which a nation first saw itself, diverse, divided, and indestructible.